Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's me, your guide from the dark side, Dawson Richard. Boom, surprise, doing a double upload this week. I had already been kind of working on this script while doing the Haunted Hospitals episode, and I had some free time and figured, why the hell not? Let's do a double upload. So here you go. How is everybody today? I hope you're doing well. I'm really happy that this podcast is taking off. I've been getting a lot of support from the people at my work, you know who you are, and also the people back home. So to you guys, thanks so much. I appreciate it. I'll try to do some more specific shout outs later on. But you guys did not come here to listen to me talk about this. You guys came here to hear some spooky shit, and let's get some spooky shit. So, as always, if you're squeamish around gore, murder, and other heinous acts of violence, please back out now. So, today's episode is going to be on a very popular legend from Tennessee known as the Bell Witch. And interestingly enough, this is actually the inspiration for a bunch of movies, including the famous Blair Witch Project, which is actually one of my favorite horror movies. By that, I mean it's the only horror movie I can sit through. But the Blair Witch Project is this found footage film that caused a huge freak out whenever it premiered because it was filmed like an actual documentary type deal. And everyone was like, oh my god, holy shit, it's fucking real. Because the director didn't tell anybody. So it was just super cool to know that was inspired by this story. But anyway, I know that I already did a paranormal episode with the haunted hospitals, but I stumbled across this while researching, and I was just really interested in it, so I hope this isn't paranormal overload for you guys who like to hear about murders and serial killers. But all formal stuff aside, let's get right into today's story. Born in Edgecombe County, North Carolina, John Bell was a hard-working man. In his later years, he apprenticed as a barrel maker and later pursued a career in farming. He married Lucy Williams in 1782 and settled on a farm he had bought earlier. The Bells prospered over the next 8 years and were among the area's most successful planters. With the birth of their first child, Jessie, they began a family. In the years that followed, John and Lucy Bell had 3 more sons, John Jr., Drury, and Benjamin. All went well until the 1801 and 1804 crop seasons, when their crops failed and they decided to move westward, as several of their friends had already done. In the winter of 1804 to 1805, John Bell and his family embarked on a journey over the treacherous mountains of North Carolina and East Tennessee that took them to an area called the Barren Plains. From there, he moved into the Red River bottomland in Robertson County, Tennessee, settling in a community, Red River, which became Adams, Tennessee, many years later. Bell purchased some land and a large house for his family. Over the next several years, he acquired more land, increasing his holdings to 328 acres, and cleared a number of fields for planting. He also was made an elder of Red River Baptist Church. The Bells also had 3 more children after moving to Tennessee. Elizabeth, who will be known as Betsy, was born in 1806, Richard was born in 1811, and Joel was born in 1813. One day in 1817, John Bell was inspecting his cornfield when he encountered a strange-looking animal sitting in the middle of a corn row. Shocked by the appearance of this animal, which he claimed had the body of a dog and the head of a rabbit, Bell shot several times. The animal vanished. Bell thought nothing more about the incident, at least not until after dinner. That evening, the Bells began hearing beating sounds on the outside walls of their log house. John's son approached an unknown bird perched on a fence later that evening that flew off and was of extraordinary size. The daughter Betsy observed a girl in a green dress swinging from the limb of an oak tree, and even Dean, a slave of the Bell family, reported being followed by a large black dog on evenings that he would visit his wife. The family heard sounds of gnawing on the beds, invisible dogs fighting, and chains along the floor. About this time, John Bell began experiencing paralysis in his mouth. The phenomenon grew in intensity as sheets were pulled from beds where the children slept, and their pillows were tossed to the floor by a seemingly invisible entity. Soon, the entity pulled hair and scratched the children, with particular emphasis on Betsy, who was slapped, pinched, and stuck with pins. So, at this point, I don't know about you all, but I would have already gotten right the hell out of there. Like footsteps and doors slamming are one thing, because that's just like your regular ghost stuff. But once I start seeing like dog-rabbit hybrids and like giant-ass birds and shit starts getting thrown around at me, like, no thanks, I'm sleeping outside. So with all this happening, the Bells turned to a family friend, James Johnston, for help. After retiring for the evening at the Bell home, Johnston was awakened that night by the same phenomena. That morning, he told John Bell that it was a spirit, just like in the Bible. Soon, word of the haunting began to spread, and many people traveled great distances just to see the witch. The apparition began to speak out loud in a female voice and was asked, "Who are you and what do you want?" The voice answered, "I am a spirit. I was once very happy, but I have been disturbed." The spirit also offered diverse explanations of why it had appeared, tying its origin to the disturbance of a Native American burial mound located on the property. She also sent Drew Bell and Bennett Porter on an unproductive search for buried treasure. With the emergence of these full conversations, the spirit repeated word for word 2 sermons that were being given 13 miles apart at the same time. The entity was well acquainted with biblical text and appeared to enjoy religious arguments. As another amusement, the witch shared gossip about activities around other households, and at times appeared to leave for brief moments to go visit homes after the inquiry. So John devised this test for the witch, something that no one outside that his family would know, and he asked the entity what his Dutch step-grandmother in North Carolina would say to the slaves if she thought they did something wrong. The witch replied with his grandmother's accent, saying, "Hut tut, what has happened now?" Racist, I know, the whole slave thing, but moving on. In another account, an Englishman stopped to visit and offered to investigate the house. On remarking of his family's overseas, the witch suddenly began to mimic his parents over in England. Again, in the early morning, the witch woke him to the voices of his parents. They were worried because they had also heard their son's voice in their home back in England. The Englishman quickly left that morning and later wrote to the Bell family that the entity had visited his family in England that same night. He apologized for his skepticism. Now, despite all this malice, the spirit displayed a form of kindness, especially towards Lucy, John Bell's wife. The entity would say that she was the most perfect woman to walk the earth, and would give Lucy fresh fruits and sing hymns to her, and even showed John Bell Jr. a measure of respect. Word of this supernatural phenomenon soon spread outside the settlement, even to Nashville, where then Major General Andrew Jackson took a keen interest. John Bell Jr., Drury Bell, and Jesse Bell, John Bell's oldest sons, had fought under General Jackson in the Battle of New Orleans. In 1819, Jackson decided to visit the Bell farm and see what all the fuss was about. Jackson's group consisted of several men, some well-groomed horses, and a wagon. As they approached the Bell property, the wagon stopped suddenly. The horses couldn't pull it. After several minutes of cursing and trying to coax the horses into pulling the wagon, Jackson proclaimed, "By the Eternal, boys, this must be the Bell Witch." Then, a disembodied female voice told Jackson that they could proceed and that she would see them again later that evening. They were then able to proceed across the property, up the lane, and to the Bell home, where Jackson and John Bell had a long discussion about Native Americans and other topics, while Jackson's men waited to see if the entity was going to manifest. One of Jackson's men claimed to be a witch hunter. After several uneventful hours, he pulled out a shiny pistol and proclaimed that its silver bullet would kill any evil spirit that came into contact with it. He went on to say that the reason nothing had happened to them was because whatever had been disturbing the Bells was scared of his silver bullet. Immediately, the man screamed and began jerking his body in different directions, complaining that he was being struck with pins and beaten severely. A strong, swift kick to the man's posterior region from an invisible foot sent him out the front door. Angry, the entity then spoke up and announced that there was yet another fraud in Jackson's party, and that he would be identified and tormented the following evening. Now terrified, Jackson's men begged to leave the Bell farm, but Jackson, on the other hand, insisted on staying so that he could ascertain who the other fraud was. The men eventually went outside to sleep in their tents, but continued begging Jackson to leave. What happens next is unclear, but Jackson and his group were spotted in nearby Springfield early the next morning. apparently en route to Nashville. There's a lot of argument over whether or not Jackson ever actually went to the Bell family home. A lot of people say that it's just to embellish the story and make it seem more real, to give it credibility. But as far as we know, there's no real record of Jackson ever being in that part of Tennessee at that time. So over this time, Betsy Bell became interested in Joshua Gardner, a young man who lived not far from her. With the blessing of their parents, they decided they wanted to get married. Everyone was happy about the engagement, except for the Bell Witch. The entity, for reasons unknown to this day, repeatedly told Betsy not to marry Joshua Gardner. So Betsy and Joshua had this former school teacher named Richard Powell, and he was really into Betsy at the time and had expressed some interest in marrying her when she became older, which is weird because he's 11 years older than her, which I get not weird at the time, and people, can be with who the fuck they want to be with, but when it's when the person is a child at the time and you're like, hey, when you get older, we'll see, it's just a weird time to start taking a fancy in somebody. But anyway, this Powell guy apparently was claimed to be a student of the occult, so he was dabbling into some dark shit apparently, but it's never been proven. So according to these old accounts, Powell politely expressed his disappointment with Betsy's engagement and wished her a long and prosperous marriage with Joshua Gardner. But around this time, Betsy and Joshua would go down to the field, the river, and the cave to try and just have some alone time and hang out. But they couldn't because the entity would taunt them persistently. Their patience finally reached critical points, and on the Easter Monday of 1821, Betsy met Joshua at the river and broke off their engagement. The disturbances decreased after Betsy ended the engagement. So by this point, old Papa Bell has been experiencing episodes of twitching in his face and difficulty swallowing for almost a year, and the affliction seemed to grow worse with time. By the fall of 1820, his declining health had confined him to the house, where the entity commenced removing his shoes when he tried to walk and slapping his face when he experienced seizures. Her loud, shrill voice could be heard all over the farm, cursing and chastising Old Jack Bell, as she often referred to him. John Bell breathed his last breath on the morning of December 20th, 1820, after slipping into a coma the day before. Immediately after his death, the family found a small vial of unidentified liquid in the cupboard. John Bell Jr. gave some of it to the cat, which died instantly. The entity then spoke up, exclaiming joyfully, "I gave old Jack a big dose of that last night, which fixed him." John Jr. quickly threw the vial into the fireplace, where it burst into a bright bluish flame and shot up the chimney. John Bell's funeral was one of the largest ever held in Robertson County, Tennessee. As family and friends began leaving the graveyard, the entity laughed loudly and began singing drinking songs. It is said that her singing didn't stop until the very last person left the graveyard. The entity's presence was almost non-existent after John Bell's demise, as if its purpose had been fulfilled. So a lot of people at the time believed that the Bell Witch was a ghost by the name of Kate Batts, a disgruntled former neighbor of the Bell family who was certain that John had cheated her in his land purchase. Some even say that on her deathbed she swore to haunt the family from beyond the grave. Others say that it was a spirit that had always lived in that part of the country. In April of 1821, the entity visited John Bell's widow, Lucy, and told her that it would return for a visit in 7 years. The entity then returned in 1828, just as promised. Most of its visits centered around John Bell Jr., with whom the entity discussed such things as the origin of life, civilizations, Christianity, and the need for a mass spiritual reawakening. Of particular significance were its nearly accurate predictions of the Civil War and other events. The entity said farewell after 3 weeks, promising to visit John Bell's most direct descendant in 107 years. The year would have been 1935, and the closest living direct descendant of John Bell at that time was Nashville physician Dr. Charles Bailey Bell. Dr. Bell himself wrote a book about the Bell Witch published in 1934. In the work, he recounted stories he stated were told to him by his great-aunt Betsy later in her life. This included another account of Andrew Jackson's visit and a boy trapped in the Bell Witch Cave who was pulled out of the cave feet first by the witch. No follow-up was published, and Dr. Bell died in 1945. Now, this doesn't mean that the witch doesn't still haunt the area. The entity that tormented the Bell family in the Red River settlement almost 200 years ago is still blamed for unexplainable manifestations that occur near the old Bell farm today. The faint sounds of people talking and children playing can sometimes be heard in the area, and it's not uncommon to see candle lights dance through the dark fields late at night. Photography is especially difficult. Some pictures taken in the area show mist, orbs of light, and other phenomena, including human-like figures who were not present when the pictures were being taken. The most recent stories of the Bell Witch start in 1937, where there were reports of quirky events associated with the Bell Witch. Lewis Garrison, owner of the farm that includes the Bell Witch Cave, heard unexplained noises coming from inside. Bell descendants described the sound of something rubbing against a house, a paper-like object that flew out the door and re-entered through a side door, and faint music heard from a piano. A group from the local Epworth League were reported to have attended a wiener roast in a rock quarry near the Bell Witch Cave on July 29, 1937. The group was joking about the legend when they saw a figure of a woman sitting on top of the cliff over the cave, causing many of them to flee. According to the newspaper, a minister in the group later claimed to have investigated and discovered that it was just moonlight on a rock. This was disputed, however, when a weather report stated that the moon was barely noticeable that night. A man named Jim Brooks published in 2015 that his mother was one of the teens in attendance at the roast, and relates that the minister caught up to the youth on the road in town after discovering no explanation for the figure. Another wild story from the Bell Witch comes from Bonnie Hannaline. In 1977, she recounted a time during her childhood in 1944 when she was exploring the cave. She left English class, playing hooky, and borrowed a lantern from Mrs. Garrison, the cave owner. She reported to have explored the cave with her friends for several years, so she was familiar with the surroundings. While she was inside, her lantern blew out, despite no breeze being inside the cave. She managed to relight the lantern, and it blew out again. Terrified, she crawled along the water path of the cave in the dark until she reached the entrance, where she saw an opened can of pork and beans and marshmallows. Later that evening, she learned that law enforcement discovered 2 escaped fugitives in the back of the cave. She credited the witch with helping her avoid them. Another visit in 1977 was reported of 5 soldiers from nearby Fort Campbell to the Bell Witch Cave. One of the soldiers was sitting on a rock and expressed skepticism for the legend when something invisible grabbed him around the chest. In 1986, staff writer David Gerard for the Tennessean and photographer Bill Wilson were given permission to sleep in the cave overnight. While in the first cave room, they heard a noise from deeper into the cave. Gerard estimated that it was about 30 yards further in. An unwavering groan, repeated again with greater volume and accompanied by several loud thumps. When it began a third time, the men retreated to the gate entrance. They explored the wiring to the lights, looking for a reason for the noises. As they reached the gate, a loud, high-pitched scream emanated from inside the cave. The journalists left and did not spend the night. Finally, and most recently in 1987, H.C. Sanders, owner of a nearby gas station, reported that many years ago he ran out of gas one night near the Red River across from the Bell Witch Cave. He began to walk towards town when a rabbit came out of the woods and began to follow him. Sanders walked faster, but the rabbit kept pace, even when he broke out into a run. After a mile of sprinting for his life, Sanders sat down on a log to catch his breath. The rabbit hopped up on the other side of the log, looked at him, and said, "Hell of a race we had there, wasn't it?" The cause of the Bell's torment almost 200 years ago, as well as today's horrid, unexplainable manifestations, remains a mystery. Numerous theories exist to try to make sense of the whole ordeal. Some believe that it was all just a fabricated story by the youngest Bell son. Others think some of the paranormal activity was achieved by the school teacher, Richard Powell, who gathered a group of friends to scare Betsy and Gardner into calling off their engagement. None of these stories are agreed upon, and probably never will be. Different people have different standards of proof. Most do agree, though, that there was something very wrong at the Red River settlement in the 1800s, and that there may very well be something wrong there today. So that's the episode, you guys. That's the Bell Witch. I hope you enjoyed it. What do you think? Was the Bell Witch fake, or is there something wicked going on over at the Bell place? But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope I can make your week just a little bit more spooky, a bit more entertaining, and I appreciate all the support that you guys give. It really does mean a lot. I read all the comments. I take all your feedback into account. So thanks again for watching, and don't forget to tune into the next episode where we will be talking about Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, the Murder Castle Killer. Take it easy and stay weird, everybody.